Okay, so flipping over to Maya, I have my plane already in the scene, and I have an Arnold light as well already in the scene. So if I were to just do a quick render as is, it's just a normal white plane with a Lambert material. So let's go ahead and add in all of the maps. And the first thing that we can do is we can assign the AI standard surface material. So right-clicking, going to assign new material, we can go to Arnold and AI standard surface. So I'm going to work a little bit backwards here just to show you the effects of some of the maps. To start out with, I'm going to go up to this little blue ball at the top, and this is the Hypershade Network. And if I were to pull it up, there's nothing right now in the Hypershade area. If there were, we could hit this little like star button to clear it out. I can go over to this AI standard surface that I just created. This is our list of materials. If I right click and hold it, I can go down to Graph Network and let go the right click. So this is our material in node-based form. So first I'm going to add the height map. And the height map is a displacement type shader that changes the geometry to physically add crevices and valleys and hills, unlike a normal map which just kind of fakes it with shadowing. So I'm going to go to my height material that I had created in Substance, which is just in my downloads folder for here, and I'm just going to drag it on, and that creates this little file node right here. So if I take the out color and before I do that, I'm going to do a quick render of this default plane just so we can show the difference. I'm going to hit this little camera button at the bottom to take a snapshot of what it's going to be looking like. So going back to the Hypershade, I'm going to drag the color input node into the displacement shader output node. And when we do that, if I were to render it, we can kind of see that there's a little bit of squares and weird shading here as opposed to the default plane. And the plane itself is being raised a little bit, which is not what we want, obviously. So there's a few things that we need to do to this height map in order to get it how we want. The first thing is on the material, which from the render I can just click on the object. We can go to the shape node, not the actual material edits itself, but the shape node in the attribute editor. And we can go down to Arnold, and under Arnold there are two settings. There's subdivision and displacement attributes. Both of these are relevant to height maps. For subdivision, we want to turn on Cat Clark. And so if I were to render that right away, we can already see that it's kind of different. It's already trying its best to do a shading technique. The iterations here are essentially subdivisions. So essentially it's the same as hitting the 3 key on the keyboard, but instead of changing the subdivisions in the render view, or in the preview view, and slowing down Maya, the iterations here only affects the renderer. So we can have a very low poly object with high divisions and it'll look very smooth. So if I were to bump up this iterations to 2, we can already see that a lot more details coming in. If I go up to 3, 4, 5, a lot more is starting to come in with each time. So I'm going to actually do a camera snapshot of this one, and I'm going to go up to 6 just to see if there's any sort of difference, because at some point it'll just be the extra subdivisions won't even be needed. So it looks like there's a difference at 6. Maybe I'll go to 7 just to see what it's like. That looks like it might be getting a bit too much. I'm going to keep it at 6 for now. So now we have our height map set up, and if I were to change views, you can actually see that the plane is no longer flat. It's actually physically distorting the plane to add hills and valleys. That's essentially what a height map does. Now we can move on to the other ones. So if I minimize that and go back to the AI standard surface, we can go to the color tab. And just like any other material, if we hit the checkerboard box, we can add a file node and look for our base color material that was gotten from Substance Painter. In this case, it said plain default material base color for me. So I can add it in, and if I hit 6 on the keyboard, it will show us a preview of the color image. One thing important to note is the color space for this is sRGB, and under color balance we do not want alpha is luminance checked. Basically, alpha is luminance is a way of converting maps that do not have much color data into a more readable format. Some of the other maps that we're putting in, we will have alpha is luminance, but since the texture map has a lot of colors, we do not want that checked. So continuing on, going back to the material attributes, we're going to want to bump this weight up to 1. By default, the AI standard service has it around at 0.8, but since we're taking directly from Substance Painter, we want the full effect of the color thing. Same with specular, we want it at full 100%. And for the roughness, we can import the roughness the same way, clicking on the checkerboard box, finding the file. They pump it out as PNG for me. And here's where things are a little different. We want to change the color space of the roughness to raw. So going under the settings, instead of having sRGB, we want to find raw. And the reason is just because certain maps do better with changes to the color space, but a lot of these maps from Substance Painter we want to be raw. Texture is pretty much the only one that we want sRGB. The other thing is that since this is a fairly black and white map, it doesn't have much color. So we're going to turn on alpha is luminance just to make it more readable. Going back to our material again, same with metal. The metalness under the base section, we can add our file and we can put in our metal map, which as you can see, it's in this case for me it's black. So we can see that we also want raw and alpha is luminance to handle it. Going back again, we now have almost all the maps except normal map. So if we go down to the very bottom, there should be a geometry tab. And if we open it up, there's this section called bump mapping. But if we typically just click on the normal checkerboard box and import our file, it's going to actually throw us into another node first. We can add the file here just by switching over to file 4, and we can add the file like we would normally, but we're actually going to change this a little bit. So once I add the file, I'm actually going to go up into the Hypershade once again. So back up to the circular ball, and I'm just going to clear it and reset it just in case there's any changes. And right here we can kind of see the path of the normal map. So we have the bump node, we have the normal texture going into the normal camera. Now Arnold does work with the bump node. What we can do with this is on the bump node we can change it to tangent space normals, and that will help read in the normal map a bit better. But we're going to use a different node. We're going to replace this bump node. So if I hit the tab key, that brings up this little search bar. Just anywhere in this thing, if I just hit tab, I can type in normal. And we have a few options. In this case, I'm going to grab an AI normal map and just click on it. And that creates the AI normal map node. And so I can drag this out color from our normal map texture down into the input for the normal map, and then the out value into the normal camera. And so we don't need this bump node anymore. I can just delete it. So we're almost there. There's a few more things to change. First thing to change is to make sure that tangent space is checked. We are handling this as a normal map, not a bump map. And the other thing is, when we exported out our textures from Substance Painter, at the very beginning when we were setting up our object to import into Substance Painter, we had the option to choose between Directx and Opengl. And it's a very kind of confusing topic between those two, but essentially what you need to know is that certain programs use Directx and certain programs use Opengl. In our case, Arnold uses Opengl, and I could have told you guys at the beginning to choose Opengl and then you wouldn't have to do this, but for the sake of learning how to switch between things, I had you guys export out your map as a Directx map. And so if we have a Directx map, in order to handle it accurately, all we need to do is invert Y. This tells the program how to essentially read the normal map. Because between Directx and Opengl, the main difference is I believe one of the color channels is flipped. And so this corrects it for us. The other thing that we have to do is, in the actual normal tab, we just want to make sure that we are set to raw, like some of the other maps, all of them except for the diffuse map. And we do not want, this isn't actually letting me show it. We do not want alpha as luminance. We want this unchecked at the bottom. And the reason is because we're dealing with a lot of colors, and we do not want any of the colors to be sort of crushed and misread. So once we have all that, let's give it a render and see what it looks like. It might take a second because it's converting some of the textures that we had into TX files. Those are the files that Arnold likes to work with. And here it is. Here is our current texture. Two things that I forgot to mention. The first is that if we're going down into where the height map information was in the shape node, we can go down below subdivision to displacement attributes, and this height setting can affect how deep we want the height to be changed. And we can also click on auto bump to add a little bit of a more shadowing and stuff to it if we want. So that's not always a bad thing to turn on. The other thing is that sometimes we might not even need a metal map. Obviously my rock texture is not supposed to be a metal texture, and so in this case I'm actually just going to break the connection and turn it off. But as you can see, it didn't really change anything. It's still as it is, but sometimes we don't necessarily need to put in every map if we know that some of the maps aren't going to affect it. But yeah, that's pretty much the basics. That should get you started on how to work with Substance Painter a little bit and how to add in all the maps that you need for Arnold 5.